February 28, 2026. For most of the world it seemed to happen overnight, a date now burned into modern history.
It was codenamed Operation Epic Fury, and it was unleashed with overwhelming force. While the exact number is not specified,
the Security Council is united in demanding immediate de-escalation from the rogue state.
But are sanctions enough to stop the nuclear program?
But the real reason for the war wasn't decided in an emergency meeting that week. It wasn't a reaction to some sudden provocation.
The war you saw on the news, that was a lie. The truth is far more complex and far more disturbing.
This war was planned for years in corporate boardrooms and clandestine geostrategic meetings. The seeds of conflict, a world on edge. So, how did we get here? To really understand how the first shock,
you have to look at the giant tectonic plates of global power that were grinding against each other for years.
The war with Iran was never just about Iran. It was a violent symptom of a world order that was changing fast.
First, you have to understand the grand chessboard. By the early 2020s, the biggest story in the world was the rivalry between the United States and a rising China.
For decades, America was the undisputed security guard of the Persian Gulf. Its navy guaranteed the free flow of energy.
But China's thirst for that same energy was growing. Beijing became the top trading partner for countries across the region, including Iran.
It brokered diplomatic deals, like the 2023 thaw between Iran and Saudi Arabia, and poured billions into its Belt and Road Initiative.
It wasn't just business, it was a strategic threat, and Iran, with its key location and huge energy reserves, became a critical pawn.
And Iran aligned with China was a long-term nightmare for American dominance. It could challenge the U.S.
So the real American goal wasn't just containing Iran's nuclear program. It was making sure Iran didn't fall into China's orbit.
So the Verteidigungsgradiation war. So the real American goal wasn't just containing Iran's nuclear program. And
the second critical piece of the puzzle was Israel. For Israel, the Iranian threat wasn't some distant game.
Iran could never, ever be allowed to get a nuclear bomb. While the world debated sanctions, Israel was planning for war.
This wasn't a secret. Israeli leaders were open about their red lines. They saw
This fear was amplified by Iran's axis of resistance, a network of proxy forces like Hezbollah in Lebanon.
From Israel's perspective, a nuclear Iran wouldn't just be a threat itself. It would give its proxies a nuclear umbrella to act without consequence.
This isn't merely a regional concern. It is an existential threat to my nation.
we understand the gravity, but military action must be...
Yes.
It was partly about shared security concerns, but it was also a meeting of strategic minds. Both sides came to believe
they were convinced that only the credible threat of overwhelming force, or actually using it, could end the nuclear threat for good.
The final ingredient was the slow poison of economic strangulation.
The goal was to cripple Iran's economy, cut it off from global finance, and stir up unrest, hoping to force the regime to negotiate.
It sped up its nuclear program, enriching uranium to higher purities and kicking out international inspectors. It relied on black market oil sales, often to China, to stay afloat, which only strengthened the very connection Washington wanted to break.
It created a strange paradox. The sanctions meant to prevent a war actually made one more likely.
They convinced the hawks in Washington and Jerusalem that since sanctions weren't enough, something more drastic had to be done.
It created a strange paradox. The sanctions meant to prevent a war actually made one more likely.
The sanctions wiped out any middle ground for diplomacy, leaving two positions that couldn't coexist. With
these three factors, the great power competition with China is...
They built a geopolitical trap with no peaceful way out. Every move and countermove just tightened.
The path to war is rarely a straight line. It's a series of escalations, bad calculations, and closing doors.
For the US, Israel, and Iran,
the year 2020 and the first weeks of 2026.
The world tipped from a state of crisis to the edge of open war. This was the point of no return.
The first huge sign that things had changed for that came and changed for good.
And this is where the script flipped. The United States, which had always kept some distance, jumped in directly.
American forces launched their own strikes against heavily fortified Iranian nuclear facilities at Fordow, Natanz, and Isfahan.
Operation Midnight Hammer was a strategic win for the US and Israel, but it was a disaster for diplomacy.
Lead flow. It proved to the Iranians that their defenses could be broken. Israeli strikes reportedly killed over 30 senior nuclear.
The strikes set the nuclear program back, maybe a few months, maybe a couple of years, but they didn't collapse.
For the Hawks, this was the ultimate proof. Small-scale strikes weren't enough. Only a complete takedown of the regime would work.
After that brief, bloody conflict, they tried one last time to talk, in the shadow of a massive American military buildup in the region.
ما این تحقیر را نمیپذیریم. ما هرگز خود را خلا سلاح نخواهیم کرد.
The talks collapsed in early 2026, and the sound of that final diplomatic door slamming shut.
But the final push, the one that made war inevitable, didn't come from a general or a diplomat. It came from the streets of Iran.
We want justice! Down with the regime! We want justice! Down with the regime!
The massacres were filmed and shared on social media, shocking the world and exposing just how paranoid and weak the Iranian government had become.
The war, the protests gave them three things. First, to planners in Washington and Jerusalem, this was it. The perfect moral justification.
A war could now be framed as a righteous mission to save the Iranian people from their own murderous government.
The assessment was that the regime was at its most vulnerable, hated at home and weakened by sanctions and military setbacks. The airstrikes weren't just about blowing up military targets. They were meant to be a spark, to break the secure forces' will to fight.
With diplomacy dead, a successful dress reel in the books, and a strategic huge of Iran.
The military buildup was no longer a threat. It was an invasion force in waiting.
Let's agree on midway through January 2026 was an illusion.
From warships in the Arabian Gulf and destroyers in the Mediterranean, the first wave of American Tomahawk cruise missiles ripped through the sky toward a nation that was, for a few more moments, at peace. This was the opening act of Operation Epic Fury, a symphony of destruction planned and executed with overwhelming technological power.
U.S. Central Command, or CENTCOM, orchestrated a multi-pronged attack designed to blind, deafen, and paralyze the Iranian state.
B-2 Spirit stealth bombers, flying from bases thousands of miles away, slipped through radar to deliver their bombs with pinpoint accuracy.
"10 minutes after the American assault began, the second phase kicked in. This was Israel's part, codenamed Roaring Lion.
While the Americans were taking apart the machine of war, Israel was going for the jugular. It was a single, shocking blow designed to create chaos and a power vacuum in the very first hour of the war. But that was just the beginning. In that same initial wave, Israeli jets dismantled the symbols of the regime's power.
Unleash the full force of our revenge! All units, execute the launch sequence immediately.
Launching missiles. Trajectory confirmed.
We fight until they are definitively defeated!
Definitively defeated!
But the retaliation spread much further. 14 separate U.S. military bases across the Middle East were targeted.
It was during this first wave of retaliation that the United States suffered its first casualties of the war.
As the sun rose on the second day, March 1st, there was no break. Israeli strikes hammered central Tehran.
The U.S. Air Force continued its relentless campaign, with more B-2 bombers joining the attack.
The goal was to leave no part of the regime's security apparatus standing, and to induce a state of total system collapse. The combination of American systemic destruction and Israeli decapitation was meant to be a fatal 1-2 punch.
But as missile alerts blared from Tel Aviv to Riyadh, and as Iranian civilians began to pay the price for their leader,
The public was told this was a war of necessity, a defensive action. But behind that sanitized narrative are the real reasons.
The main public reason for the war was stopping Iran from getting the bomb. But the evidence suggests the real objective was
The nuclear program was the perfect casus belli, the legal and moral cover for a war that was wanted for other.
It's the language of externally engineered revolution. The military strategy proves it. A campaign to just damage nuclear sites would look totally different.
A strategy aimed at creating a power vacuum so complete that the regime couldn't survive. The nuclear threat provided the key.
Reason 2, a proxy war against China. This war was never just about the Middle East. It was about the 21st century.
This partnership is a direct challenge to American power in the region. What is the Pentagon's response?
We are repositioning assets to ensure stability, Senator.
Iran is more than a country. It's a piece of strategic geography. It sits at the crossroads of the Middle East and Asia.
More importantly, it holds a choke point on the global economy, the Strait of Hormuz. A strong, independent...
Think about it. By toppling the regime in Tehran, the U.S. could hit a strategic jackpot. It could install a pro-Western government, turning shots. This would secure a massive source of energy for the West while denying it to a rival. It would place a major American ally.
Reason 3, Israel's zero-hour doctrine. For Israel, this wasn't a war of choice. It was seen as a war of survival.
The strategy wasn't just about setting back the nuclear program. It was about permanently eliminating the entire Iranian threat.
Israel's strategy of preemptive decapitation was ruthless. Their goal was to eliminate the entire Iranian leadership.
This was about more than the bomb. It was about cutting the head off the octopus, the central command that armed, funded.
The Israeli calculation was that, by removing the leadership in Tehran, the entire proxy network would collapse without its master.
But this wasn't about restoring the old status quo. It was about creating a new one. A Middle East without...
It would open the door for more Arab countries to normalize relations with Israel and solidify an American-led security structure for decades.
Understanding these real motives behind the headlines is critical if you want to keep exploring the forces that really shape our world.
The initial devastating phase of Operation Epic Fury was clinically successful. Leaders were eliminated.
But the end of a regime is not the end of the story. The declaration of victory didn't bring peace and stability.
The immediate result was a human catastrophe. With over 2,000 dead in Iran, Lebanon and Israel in the...
Across the region, airspace was closed, states of emergency were declared, and hundreds of thousands of diverse...
Iran itself, despite the death of its Supret leader, did not just surrender. The formation of an interim council ensured that the resistance... The missile strikes against Gulf states, Jordan, and Turkey were a desperate attempt to pull the pillars down on everyone's heads. Iran's closure of the Strait of Hormuz to enemy ships immediately choked off 20% of the world's oil supply and sent energy prices soaring.
The war exposed deep cracks in the international order.
The U.S. and Israel acted together, but European allies...
The American and Israeli gamble was that a popular uprising would lead to a stable, pro-Western democracy.
Instead of a quick victory, the United States and its allies found themselves stuck in a costly, drawn-out war against a determined enemy. As of the spring of 2026, the conflict rages on. It leaves us with the sober.
Or does starting a war, no matter how justified it seems, simply unleash a storm that no one can navigate?
But as many analysts warned, hope is not a strategy. A chaotic civil war, the rise of an even more ruthless...
A fractured Iran could become a black hole of instability for a generation. A scenario far worse than the one the war was meant to prevent.
The 2026 Iran war was presented as the end of a
process. It showed that in this new era of great power competition, smaller nations can become bloody battlegrounds for the ambition. They've unleashed a new world disorder, and as always, the ultimate price is paid not by the architects of the conflict, but by the ordinary people.